said with Iraj here. Recently, there has been an acceleration of the global brain drain from developing to developed countries. The emergence of the global economy has been a key cause of many societies losing overseas some of their most talented and educated, highly qualified people. Okay, that's all of you. Because that includes PhD students. A lot of PhD students never go home, but that's another question. So the first sentence or two is set the context. It's a little bit of what you saw with the cars approach of John Swales. Where are you going to have the niche in a certain area? So the first sentence or two, but what you must focus on, why should somebody read this? So we also then say, what are you going to do in this paper that you can explore a problem, maybe you're going to try and suggest a solution, or maybe you're going to develop a framework, something like this. So what do we say here? So we then set the scene. A combination of brain drain, push-pull factors will need to be a policy focus of any government wishing to try and reverse the brain drain. So we brought in that this is a paper that's going to really make a theoretical contribution to the idea of push-pull factors. In fact, it's a very common model in business studies. It's linking to concepts of supply and demand, supply chain. These sorts of concepts are really, push and pull is very much relevant to a lot of things. And one of the ideas, in fact, I tried to put in this is that in a global setting, including transnational supply chains, the whole dynamics of push-pull changes. We're talking about global system, not just national system. Anyway, I won't go any further. So we wanted to explore that as a theoretical model, and then we say the paper will discuss the key push-pull factors and related dilemmas that need to be addressed by any proposed government policies. And then you'll see, in terms of a literature review linked to a discussion of examples, the paper will thus attempt to answer 3 questions. So this was a literature review type paper, and there are journals that will publish them. This got published, a literature review got transformed. There are journals that will publish this. So in business and policy studies, there are quite a lot of journals, you need to find them. So we put in 3 questions, but you see, most abstracts for journal, they usually have a limit. Some of them are about 200 words, some of them are actually very short, some of them will say 125. Even one conference, etc., they said 50 words, not one more word than 50 words. So this is quite disciplined to have the selection and combination of the words where you have 50 words to explain what you're doing. Then you have to be very disciplined, but you still use a little bit of the same structure. The first sentence, what's the back, why should we read this, what's the context? And then you end up saying, what's the real contribution of the paper?
Yeah. We have been advised that when you are doing a PhD business school, either we are looking at business perspective or we are looking at theoretical perspective. So when, for instance, my case, I start from business perspective. In my abstract, do I need to start with like this market is like developing and experiencing growth? That's why there are lots of scholarly investigation, those kind of things. Or I need to go straight to the point that like using empirical data, this study is going to generate a model or something.
Well, part of that relates, as I said, to whether you do an IMRAD paper where you're going to look at the analysis of data and sort of find it. But my point is that a lot of what I'm telling you for this actually should be also for the IMRAD paper. An IMRAD, if you just send an IMRAD paper saying I'm going to discuss the data collection of a study on this, most editor will pick it up and throw it in rubbish bin. Right? There's a few other reasons they throw it rubbish bin. But a lot of editors never look at anything. You have to grab your attention. That's why you have to make it a bit more interesting, even if it's an IMRAD paper. So a lot of what I'm telling you is for both kinds of, at least at the beginning, and some of the introduction is the same thing. The introduction will go a bit further. And the introduction, so basically, let me give a bit of an overview. I mean, I think the direct question you're asking me is how you frame this could be for the different purpose. If you're focusing more on new marketing approaches are needed for the digital age with an example of game applications for smartphones. You frame it that way that maybe you frame it that the marketing issue for games is different in the new smartphone context as opposed to the old digital video games. Something like that. You put something up, you make that point. You have to make that point to say, what are you going to be doing? We should read this. Why read this? Well, what is the contribution? So either you're then going to look at the problem or you're going to try to offer some solution to the problem. Now, literature review can be just framing to say that where you can start to come up with some more useful answers, but you don't actually put them in the paper. So a little bit of that's the same thing. If it's an INRAD paper, you can still sort of set the same sort of interesting context. But again, in your case, whether it's sort of focusing more on the marketing or focusing more on some entrepreneur wanting to be successful, making lots of money, developing new games, that's a different audience, slightly different purpose. Even though you could use the same data and you could use the same literature review. And there's another bit of advice. A little bit of my other advice. I have worked with some colleagues over 20 years that they could do one small study and they write 12, 15 papers on the same study. They can change something and do a little bit differently. So if you really want to become successful academic, there's one of the secrets. Write 10 papers on the same thing. Just change everything a little bit. It's also a bit of a secret that if it goes to one journal and they didn't like it, you can rewrite it by reframing it a little bit differently. There's another bit of advice I can give you. It's very easy to do.
So, when you want to start to write a paper, you need to be clear about our audience. I mean, like, you already know who our audience is.
You need to always be clear on audience, but the audience depends. The PhD audience is a bit different to the journal audience. The journal audience is both editors and I think it's also the readers of this particular journal.
Right.
So one of the secrets of all academic writing is to understand you're dealing with what we call gatekeepers. Gatekeepers with PhD, do we allow this person to come into the academic and give them a PhD? Gatekeepers with journals is they tend to say, does this paper fit into the purpose and the typical audience and purposes of the journal? So you really should go and do a little bit of what I recommend is developing a little of your own simple database. And what I do is I just go to the journal, and if you go and find on the journal, they will have some of the advice to submitting authors. And they'll have two things that you should cut and paste into a database. So that you should have a list maybe of 10 journals that you might target. Now you can do this in 1 hour. 1 hour you do a Google search or whatever and find Google Scholar and some of these other, and you get on the, you can also, another hint is go to some good journal papers in your area and look at the reading references and you'll see some of the journals that will be relevant to your area. There's a lot of tricks, but let me just say this, if I write in many, many different areas, it takes me always 1 hour to highlight the audience, the purpose, a particular journal, and then I can cut and paste. I go to the website for the journal. They will have the format for the paper. They will also often have a statement of who is our readers and what do we try to do with this journal. And that information should be almost enough by itself in many cases to say, should I write for this? If it's not clear enough, you then go and read some of the papers. But the bottom line is it should take you an hour, maybe 2 hours, to target 10 different possible journals and then develop a database that you then say, this will be the best journal to send my paper to. And this helps because it helps you to actually say, how do I write the paper? How do you frame it? So I think also in this case, this paper, we actually framed a couple of times and we sent to a couple of different journals. And some journals, they will tell you within 1 or 2 days sometimes, this is not for us. Try, and sometimes they try another journal. so let me get back to the advice. The next thing I would say is, you see, I included this because my advice generally for both IMRAD, slightly different IMRAD and literature, all sort of papers is normally I would recommend a generic. You always need to have abstract. I always would say I expect to see 3 or 4 paragraphs of introduction. In some papers you'll see 3 pages, or they say one paragraph. But I think what you're really doing is building the abstract to the introduction, is translating the paragraph into a little more detail. And the detail can be both, sometimes it's theoretical, your problem is theoretical and you're looking at marketing, or your problem is more practical, or a bit of both.
Do we need to bring our finding or expected finding to abstract?
Sometimes, yes, that's a good question. Sometimes if you really, really want to get attention, etc., I think it can be a good strategy. Not necessarily to give, but to say this is what we're doing. We're looking to find this to address them. So you should, in one sense, you should say this, that you are trying to find. So in my paper on the water sector for Malaysia, I said, well, Malaysia is about to run out of water. What is needed to find a solution? So I put this up in the abstract. I didn't actually, and this paper I actually wrote last year, and the journal said that they like it and they want some changes, and I've been too busy. Because the water almost run out, I've just rewritten the paper because I think, in the first paragraph, I've got all the newspaper articles, some references of 2014, with a quote at the top from last week. Last week on the front page was, this is worse than 1998. They had the graph, you saw the headline. Well, I put this as a quote right at the beginning of the paper to grab the attention that this is an important issue, not just in climate change, every country is running out of water.
So everything is about having a strategy?
Everything is about having a strategy, everything. If you're just walking along and say, this is going to happen, if you're very, very lucky, it happens. But if you have a strategy, you're just making more sense. So the strategies are really basically, you've got to contextualise why this is important, why anybody should read it, and why the journal should publish it. And that's why I often put at the beginning, why this, I wrote a bit on sustainability. So we have to scare people and say, I have to put up something in the beginning to say this is a really important issue. So I put up a quote about Malaysia has never run out of water, a country where it rains every day. This is a big problem. And it's also a big problem for many other countries. But if it's a problem for Malaysia, it's a much, much bigger problem for other countries that don't rain.
More on the political reasons, the federal government and the state
Well,
government.
that all comes into it, but what I was trying to do in this paper is that I'm trying to show what I call that sustainable policies need what I call complex problem solving. And you need to cover a range of different problems. So I'm going to, in the paper I actually go into that. So the politics are in, whatever, but it's for a lot of reasons. There's drainage problems, there's problems of runoff and dams, there's problems of people, one of the big problems is that people keep wasting water. People here in Malaysia cannot believe we're about to run out of water, so they keep leaving the tap on. So we need, in other words, my argument was that one solution will never work. We need integrated policy solutions to a range of problems. And we need the government and the private sector and research and development and the community all have to be part of it. Especially the community have got to stop wasting water.
Yeah.
So I won't go into the argument, but you see the point, just for this purpose, is that, anyway, the introduction should set the scene. The introduction then should have the first paragraph really should contextualise, as we did with 1 or 2 sentences in the abstract. The next couple of questions should go into a little bit more depth. In some papers, it's really about putting some of the relevant literature. So if it's to do with the problem, I tried to put it very up-to-date, the most up-to-date, 2014, 2013, very timely contributions, whether it's the theory or the practice. And then by the time I get to sometimes the 3rd paragraph, the 4th paragraph, You give an overview of what's going to be in the paper. So in this paper, on the second page, this paper will explore not only the role the governments can play, but also related policies in addressing both the pull and pull factors which will inform the global brain drain. The first section will visit the historical emergence of the brain drain phenomenon to provide a context of inquiry. On this basis, the second and third section will consider the main push and pull factors at work. The second section will actually be the push factors, and the third section is the pull factors. And in this way, the final section will discuss, because we then have a discussion section. This is one way that you might like to do it, but it's not the only way. I'm just giving an example. And I'm giving you mainly an example of how you frame the whole paper, and then you have the headings. That's why I basically can write the paper in a couple of hours. When I say write the paper in a couple of hours, I can just sit down and put up the idea. I have the headings and introduction. I can do that in 1 or 2 hours on any new topic. And that's the easy. If you start doing it, practice it, anybody can do it. You've got to start practicing this. And that's why, if you really become good, you change the introduction and you send off 10 papers. And you change everything a little bit if you really want to just publish for the sake of publishing. But the point to understand is the framing is everything. And that's why the abstract and introduction and having a simple way of doing it becomes easier and easier. And some of what you're doing is going to help you to actually, when you go back to the final draft of your PhD, to bring it back. I always say that we have a working abstract and a working introduction for PhD, a working problem statement. But when we do the final draft of the PhD before you submit it, you should go back and especially you should rewrite the abstract and a lot of the introduction. Because a lot of it changes and you become much clearer at the end. And that's why this is good practice. To practice writing some papers in the middle can actually help you with a PhD. Because you have to contextualise and become much clearer in what you're saying in each different section. And what am I going to... So in each introduction, I'm just mindful we have to try and finish up here. I want to link back to some of the maybe some of the tips. There's a couple of slides. Let me just start to finish off now because I think we have to start wrapping this up. So start writing from the outset, focus and structure. And this applies, I think, a little bit to papers. In the first stages, focus on getting everything down. So you should aim to do several drafts. So that's why I write the structure first, and then everything's easy after. It's quite easy to put everything in. And then the middle stages, you then should develop the knowledge pyramid, more of the content. You worry in the second stage. First stage you frame, second stage you deal with the content, and the third stage you start polishing and refining. This should be a general strategy for the paper and also for the whole PhD. And here you should be aiming more for the reader. So in the beginning you try to put in your head, and then as you polish up you do more for the reader. It's a bit like if you have an interview, a survey, the first time it's in your head, but you have to make it that people understand they can answer the question. It's the same process. Signposting is going to be some of my biggest advice just to finish. The signposting at the end. So in the last stages of writing up the paper and also the PhD, signposting is making everything clear. So see, here are some of my hints. Introductions and conclusions, not only to every chapter, but every section of the paper will have that flow. So even if the reader is only going to have a quick look, examiner only going to have 10 minutes to look at your PhD. Some examiners will only have 10 or 15 minutes. And they'll probably just contents and the introduction and conclusion of each chapter. And really, if you've been able to do a good job of linking, that's enough for an experienced reader to see that you've actually linking everything and there's an integrity there. It's not enough because if you didn't do it, you still might have a good PhD. So we still should read it, but For some readers it'll be enough that you show them. I told you the transition words from paragraph is the key. If you start looking at the paragraph, is linking up the ideas and the words. That's really one of my big hints for today. And transition words is really one of the ways to do this. And transition words are really part of the signposting in paragraphs, but it's the transitions between this chapter and the next chapter. This section and the next section, you should have transitional paragraph. So introductions, conclusions should always be a bit transitional. There is a particular format that you should start every introduction and every conclusion. And make it very simple. In every paragraph, every chapter, you say, in this paragraph I'm going to do a literature review of this topic, and I'm going to do, so I'm going to, you start by saying I'm going to look at marketing, and then I'm going to go down to, marketing for, maybe for, for game applications. But you say what's going to be here, and at the end of the chapter you say a conclusion or summary. There's different strategies for conclusion and summary, slightly different. Conclusion has a certain purpose, and summary will make clear. In this chapter, literature review, we focused on how marketing theories need to change for digital technologies. We did this, we did that. That's 3 or 4 big points. It could be even the end of the methodology of data analysis. You sort of summarise some of the key ideas, but you're linking everything together. So keywords, I've emphasised the importance of keywords, terribly important. So if you've been clear on your keywords all through the text, even the keywords and the headings are even more important. There should be an academic thread of keywords, chapter headings down to topic sentence, introduction, conclusions. Okay, you've got most of them. I think I put this up last time, but also I just finish off a little bit on this. Revision is to do with the ideas. Editing is to do with the language. So both are important, but you don't need to do editing until towards the end, where it becomes more and more important. Except if there are some problems, I give feedback to some of my students about they've got some habits. They tend to have fragments or run-on sentence. They have some particular error of, maybe they use the words the wrong way because they didn't understand the words or something. So editing should be done near the end. Revision, I think revision's a bit different. Revision should be probably 2 stages. Revision at the beginning, where we're going, have a vision that's clear of the road, the direction, the outcome, and then do it again at the end. The revision, is the examiner going to be able to read this? Put yourself into the boots. I mean, I used to say, when I did a lot of teaching at university, I used to tell my students, this is not PhD, this is the undergraduate, but I said, I want you to imagine me reading your assignment at 2 o'clock in the morning when I'm very tired and grumpy and I already read 100 assignments. You have to make very clear to me. So you have to put yourself into my shoes. So this is a very good hint that you should do this once before you do the final version for the examiner. Put yourself into the shoes of the examiner, and this will really help you, to try and improve the writing to make more clear, more economical, more efficient, more effective. Okay. There's a bit of thing called cognitive blindness. It's a very interesting phenomenon. I just mentioned it. Have you written something, and then you look at it the next day, and I read all the errors, and then a week later, you see all the mistakes. This is very important to understand. This is called cognitive blindness. You are reading in the beginning because you're too close. You're reading because what you think, your brain is thinking is going to be there. As you develop distance in time or space, you become easier. This is why, if you don't have time, you should get somebody else. This is why you have supervisor or whatever, or you should have supervisor. You should have somebody else to read that can see where the gaps are. The gaps in the language and the gaps in the ideas. Because you're too close. So part of the reason I put this up is that if you're aware of this, a good idea is that when you do a draft, you put it away for 1 week and then you come back, and it's always going to be a lot clearer. And it's a good idea before you send off to the journal, and nobody else has been able to read it. I make this mistake myself, because sometimes you have a deadline and you have to send off. And I send off, and then after I send off, I have a quick read, and I say, oh my God. And I actually have to rewrite, and I have to send them another email, so I sent you the wrong file. And sometimes they accept it, sometimes they don't. Anyway, that's a little bit of advice. I think we've finished here. There is one of the handouts I gave. I have a little bit of my checklist. This is especially the things that I'm using, the methods of what I call emergent writing. So if you want to use that, some of that might help you. One of the papers, the handouts I gave you should have that. Should have the checklist. So let me finish here. I'm happy to say a few more minutes generally. There's some of the people I met with a few weeks ago. I'll stay on to talk to them if they want to come and have a follow-up to those sessions. And if anybody has a particular problem, I'm happy to spend a few more minutes on that as well. But just to finish up, are there any last questions that anybody wants to? Yes. There's a bit of an issue. You should be using literature to identify the problems. I have a problem because the concept of variables is from a quantitative approach. It gets, I think, very confusing. So some of it translates and some of it doesn't. I much prefer to use, especially I work with a lot of business and management type students, and it's much better to talk about factors, not variables. The factors, some of them, especially internal factors, external factors. This is sort of roughly equivalent to the idea of independent variables. But it's